My name is Thomas Reed. I'm 58 years old. I grew up working with my hands in Ohio factories, loading docks, union jobs that left my back stiff and my pride intact. By the time I hit my mid-50s, I was semi-retired, living off a modest pension and whatever contract work I could still tolerate. On paper, my life looked stable. In reality, it felt finished. The day I boarded the plane to Mexico City, I told myself it was just business, nothing more. A practical decision made by a practical man who still wanted to feel useful. That was the lie I needed to believe. My business partner Dave and I had launched a small specialty import company the year before. Nothing glamorous. Handcrafted wood pieces, stools, tables, shelving from small workshops. We'd restore and finish them back in the States and sell them online to people who liked the idea of authentic. Dave and I weren't chasing millions. We were chasing relevance, a reason to wake up early again. We'd done our homework. Oaxaca, Puebla, parts of Mexico City, skilled labor, reasonable costs, pride in the work, and, this mattered more than I admitted, Mexico was close, familiar enough to feel safe. Not exotic, not reckless. At least that's what I told my wife, Linda. Linda and I had been married for 36 years. Good years mostly. Not passionate, not dramatic, just steady. We had a rhythm that worked until it didn't. Somewhere along the line, I became furniture in my own house. Useful, dependable, invisible. She didn't mean to do it, I don't think. Life just shrank around us. When I told her about the trip, she nodded and asked what time my flight was. That should have bothered me more than it did. Dave and I landed in Mexico City on a bright afternoon that smelled like dust, fuel, and something warm I couldn't place. The airport was efficient, clean, busy. Outside, the city unfolded in layers, concrete, color, movement. Nothing like the chaos I'd half expected. It felt alive. Awake. We checked into a modest hotel in Colonia Roma. Not fancy, just clean, well located, the kind of place you choose when you're trying to convince yourself you're not a tourist. Our first meeting was the next morning, a workshop on the outskirts of the city, family run. Generations of skill passed down quietly, without marketing slogans. The furniture was solid, heavy, honest. Dave was thrilled. I should have been too. That night, the workshop owner suggested a place for dinner. A small restaurant near Avenida Álvaro Obregón. Plastic chairs, open windows, laughter spilling onto the sidewalk. The food was simple, tacos, rice, beans, but it tasted like effort, like someone cared. Dave talked numbers, shipping, volume, growth. I nodded at the right moments, but my attention kept drifting outward, to the street, to the people passing by. Couples, groups of friends, young women laughing as they walked, confident and unhurried. I hadn't realized how long it had been since I noticed things like that. After dinner, Dave said he was exhausted and headed back to the hotel. I told him I'd follow shortly. Instead, I walked. No destination, just movement. The city felt safe in a way that surprised me. Busy but not threatening. Loud but not hostile. Music drifted from bars and open doors. Somewhere between Roma and Condesa, I stopped in front of a small cafe that was still open. Inside, a young woman stood behind the counter, wiping it down slowly. She looked up and smiled, not wide, not forced, just polite, real. "What can I get you?" she asked in careful English. Her name tag said Maria. I ordered coffee. We talked while she made it. Small things, where I was from, why I was in Mexico, how long I'd be staying, nothing personal, nothing inappropriate, but she listened. When she handed me the cup, our fingers brushed, accidentally, meaninglessly. My chest tightened anyway. I sat there longer than necessary, sipping coffee that had gone cold, pretending to check my phone. She moved around the cafe, cleaning, stacking chairs. Every so often, she glanced over. Not flirtatious, just aware. No one had looked at me like that in years. I left a generous tip and walked back to the hotel, annoyed at myself for feeling anything at all. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling fan, listening to the city hum through the window. I told myself I was just overstimulated. New place, new energy. That's all. The next day was another factory visit, then another. Puebla this time, early start, long drive. Dave was in his element asking about moisture content, wood sourcing, timelines. I asked questions too, but my heart wasn't in it. On the drive back, Dave mentioned wanting to check out a museum the following day. Something historic, cultural. I agreed automatically. Back at the hotel, he suggested dinner somewhere safe. Italian. Familiar. I said I wasn't hungry. That was the first time I lied without hesitation. After he went up to his room, I changed clothes and stepped back out into the evening. This time, I didn't wander aimlessly. I followed the pull. A few blocks away, the mood shifted. Louder music, dimmer lights, bars pressed close together, people lingering in doorways. Women standing in pairs, talking, laughing, watching. I stopped. Every instinct I had told me to turn around. Instead, I walked in. The bar was small, too bright, too loud. A man my age had no business being there. I knew that. But when I sat down, a woman slid onto the stool beside me as if it were the most natural thing in the world. She couldn't have been more than 25. Her name was Anna. She asked where I was from, touched my arm lightly when she laughed, leaned in close so I could hear her over the music. I bought her a drink without understanding why. She thanked me like it mattered. I felt foolish, exposed, alive. We talked for an hour, maybe two. I never asked what she did. I didn't want to know. I paid the bill and left before anything else could happen. On the walk back, my hands were shaking. I told myself I crossed the line and pulled back in time. What I didn't realize was that the line had already moved. The next morning, Dave noticed I was quiet. "You okay?" he asked over breakfast. "Jet lag," I said. It sounded believable, even to me. We spent the day doing exactly what we'd planned. Museums, walking, photos, normal things. But every ordinary moment felt like a delay, like I was waiting for something else to start. That night, I didn't even pretend. I went back out as soon as Dave closed his door. Different bar, same feeling. Another woman. Sophia, she worked nearby, she said. At a cafe, she was saving money for school. Her English was better than Anna's. She asked about my life, my work, my family. I told her just enough truth to feel honest. When she asked if I had a wife, I hesitated. "Yes," I said finally. She nodded, unbothered, as if that fact belonged to another version of me. I left again without going further. Back in my room, I sat on the edge of the bed, heart racing, trying to understand what I was doing. I hadn't cheated. Not really. I hadn't touched anyone, hadn't promised anything. So why did it feel like I was already losing something? The final meeting was scheduled for 2 days later. After that, we'd return home. Contract signed, a future secured. Everything I'd worked for was right there. And yet, as I stared out the window at the lights of Mexico City, one thought kept circling, quiet and dangerous. If this is what it feels like to be seen again, what happens when I go home and disappear? I didn't have an answer. Only the growing fear that I was already standing somewhere I wouldn't be able to walk back from. The second section of my life in Mexico didn't begin with fireworks or drama. It began quietly, the way most irreversible mistakes do. After that last night in Mexico City, I promised myself I'd behave. 2 more days, I told myself. Focus on the business. Get through the meetings. Go home. Pretend none of this ever happened. The promise lasted until noon. Dave and I spent the morning finalizing details with the workshop in Puebla. Contracts, delivery schedules, wood sourcing certifications. Everything was exactly what we'd hoped for. On paper, this trip was a success, the kind you toast to years later. At lunch, Dave excused himself to call his wife. I sat alone at the table, poking at my food, watching people pass by. Students, office workers, couples sharing plates. A normal life unfolding around me. And then I saw her. She was walking past the restaurant window, carrying a cardboard box, struggling slightly with the weight. Long, dark hair pulled back into a low ponytail. Plain blouse. Jeans. No makeup I could see. She stopped just outside the door, shifted the box in her arms, and sighed. I stood without thinking and opened the door for her. "Gracias," she said, startled, then smiled when she realized I wasn't staff. "Thank you." Her accent was soft, careful. She glanced at my plate. "Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt." No, I said quickly, "you didn't." The box tipped slightly. I reached out instinctively to steady it. "Where are you taking that?" I asked. "Just next door," she said. "I work at the cafe." "The cafe? Of course." "I can help," I said, already lifting one end. She hesitated, then nodded. "Okay, thank you." The cafe was small, bright, clean. The smell of coffee and baked bread hit me the moment we stepped inside. She set the box down behind the counter and finally looked at me properly. "I'm Lucia," she said. "You're Thomas." She thanked me again and offered me a coffee on the house. I told her I didn't want to impose. She waved it off like it was nothing. While she made it, we talked. She was 26, lived with her mother and younger brother in Iztapalapa, took 2 buses every morning to get to work, studied accounting part-time at a community college. Nothing about her story felt rehearsed. No dramatic pauses, no tragic emphasis, just facts, delivered plainly. I told her I was in Mexico for business, furniture. She asked questions, real ones. How long did it take to ship? Was the wood heavy? Did I enjoy the work? When I answered, she listened, not smiling constantly, not touching my arm, just paying attention. That's what hooked me. When Dave texted asking where I'd disappeared to, I told him I'd found a cafe and would meet him later. Careful, he replied. You're starting to sound like you don't want to leave. I laughed it off. But the truth settled heavy in my chest. That afternoon, I went back to the cafe. Then again the next morning, always for something reasonable. Coffee, a sandwich, a place to sit. Lucia never acted surprised to see me. Never acted possessive. Sometimes she was busy and we barely spoke. Sometimes she sat with me during her break and told me about her classes, her mother's arthritis, her brother's obsession with football. I didn't tell her about Linda. Not because I planned to deceive her, because saying it out loud felt like choosing which life I wanted to be real. On our last night in Mexico City, Dave suggested we celebrate. One drink. Somewhere quiet. I agreed. We went to a rooftop bar near the hotel. The city stretched out below us, endless and glowing. Dave raised his glass. To not going quietly into retirement, he said. I clinked mine against his and smiled. But my phone buzzed in my pocket. A message from Lucia. Are you leaving tomorrow? I stared at it longer than necessary. Yes, I typed. Early. I'll miss our talks, she replied. That was it. No hearts, no guilt, no pressure, just enough. Back in Ohio, a week later, everything felt smaller. The house, the conversations, the silence between Linda and me. I unpacked slowly, folding clothes that still smelled faintly of detergent from the hotel. Dave called to go over next steps, shipping timelines, marketing plans. I answered automatically. At night, I lay awake replaying conversations that meant nothing on the surface and everything underneath. 2 weeks later, Lucia messaged again. How is home? I told her it was fine. It wasn't. We started talking every day. Short messages at first, then longer ones. Voice notes when our schedules overlapped. She sent photos of the cafe, of her notes from class, of a birthday cake she'd helped her mother make. Nothing suggestive, nothing explicit, which made it worse, because I could tell myself it was harmless. Linda noticed, of course. She always did. You're on your phone a lot, she said one evening. Business, I replied. She nodded. Trusted me. That trust sat between us like something fragile I pretended not to see. 3 months later, I told Dave I needed to go back to Mexico. Already, he said. Why? They've got new designs, I said. Want us to look at expanding the line? He frowned, but shrugged. If you think it's necessary. Linda wasn't thrilled. So soon, she asked. Everything okay? Yeah, I said. This is a good thing. She believed me. When I landed in Mexico City the second time, Lucia was waiting outside the cafe at the end of her shift. She looked nervous, not excited, nervous. You came back, she said. I nodded. We walked, talked. Ate tacos from a stand near Parque Mexico. She told me she'd taken extra shifts to save money. I told her about Ohio winters and how silence can get loud when you live with someone long enough. When she took my hand, it felt natural, earned. That night, I didn't go back to the hotel. I stayed. The days blurred. Coffee in the mornings. Meetings squeezed in just enough to justify my presence. Evenings with Lucia walking, talking, existing. She never asked for money, never hinted at it. Paid for things when she could. Apologized when she couldn't. That made me want to give her more. On my last night before returning home again, we sat on a bench outside her apartment building. The street was quiet. A dog barked somewhere far off. She leaned against my shoulder. I don't know what this is, she said softly, but I know it matters to me. My chest tightened. I don't want to disappear from your life, she continued. I've had enough of that. I told her I felt the same, and I meant it. When she asked when I'd be back, I said, soon. I didn't know how soon. Back home, Linda asked how the trip went. Productive, I said. She smiled, relieved. That night, while she slept beside me, I stared at the ceiling and felt something shift inside me. Not excitement, not guilt, something colder. The realization that I was no longer trying to protect my marriage, I was trying to manage its ending. And the question that kept me awake until dawn wasn't what am I doing? It was, how long can I keep pretending this is still temporary? By the third time I flew to Mexico, I stopped pretending it was about the business. Dave didn't even argue when I told him. He just sighed into the phone, the way a man does when he already knows how a story ends but hopes he's wrong. You're sure this is necessary? He asked. I am, I said. That wasn't a lie. It just wasn't the whole truth. Linda stood in the kitchen while I packed. She didn't hover, didn't question me. She'd started doing that thing where she gave me space, as if distance might fix whatever was quietly breaking between us. How long this time? She asked. 10 days, I said. She nodded. Okay. No fight. No suspicion. Just trust. It felt heavier than anger ever could have. Lucia met me at the airport with a shy smile that didn't quite hide her nerves. She looked thinner, tired, still beautiful in that understated way that made me feel chosen instead of hunted. You look exhausted, I said. I picked up extra shifts, she replied. School is expensive. I should have stopped her there. Should have asked more questions. Should have kept things where they were. Instead, I said, let me help. She shook her head immediately. No, I don't want that. I want to, I insisted. It's not charity, it's partnership. The word sounded good when I said it. She hesitated, then nodded slowly. Maybe just a little. For books. It was a small amount, barely noticeable to me, enough to mean something to her. That's how it started. I rented a nicer apartment that trip, told myself it was practical. Closer to suppliers. Better internet. A place where Lucia could stay comfortably when she came over. She cooked sometimes. Simple meals, eggs, rice, soup. She'd apologize for not being better at it. I'm not very domestic, she said once, embarrassed. I don't need domestic, I replied. I just need you. The words came out easily. Too easily. The business meetings happened in between, just enough to keep the lie alive. Dave flew down once, spent 3 days with us reviewing samples, then left early. You seem distracted, he said before heading to the airport. I'm fine. He looked at me for a long moment. Just remember what you're risking. I watched him walk away and told myself he didn't understand. Back home, Linda noticed the distance widening. I was physically present but emotionally elsewhere. Always tired, always checking my phone, always planning the next trip. One night, she asked quietly, is there someone else? I froze. No, I said too quickly. She searched my face, then looked away. Okay, that was the night I realized she didn't want the truth. She wanted peace, and I was stealing even that from her. Lucia and I talked about the future in vague, careful ways, not promises, just possibilities. I don't want to work at the cafe forever, she said one evening. I want something stable, something where I don't have to worry every month. You won't, I said without thinking. She smiled, relieved, grateful. That look did something dangerous to me. On my 4th trip, she asked if I'd help her move her mother to a better apartment, somewhere closer to a hospital, somewhere safer. It's temporary, she said quickly, just until she feels stronger. I agreed before asking how much. Each yes made the next one easier. The money wasn't the problem. I had savings, a pension. Linda and I lived modestly. I wasn't draining accounts. I wasn't panicking, not yet. What I didn't realize was how quickly money changes the shape of affection. Lucia started relying on me in small ways, asking my opinion, waiting for my approval, letting me decide where we ate, what we did. Not because she was submissive, but because it made sense. I was older, established, helpful, needed. That feeling was intoxicating. Back in Ohio, Linda stopped asking when I'd be home. The house felt like a hotel. Clean, quiet, temporary. One afternoon, she sat across from me at the kitchen table and said, I feel like I'm already losing you. I looked at her and felt tired. I don't know what you want me to say, I replied. I want you to stay, she said, not physically, emotionally. I didn't answer. A month later, I told her I needed time. She nodded, tears in her eyes. How much? I don't know. That was enough. When I returned to Mexico again, this time alone, no pretense, Lucia was waiting in the apartment with a bottle of cheap wine in nervous excitement. You're really here, she said. I am. I stayed longer, 3 weeks, then 6. I started handling business remotely. Dave took over most of the logistics. We argued more. Short calls. Tension. This isn't what we agreed to, he said once. Things change. He was quiet for a long time. So do people. Lucia asked if I'd help her quit the cafe. I don't want to depend on customers anymore, she said. I want to study full-time. How much would you need? I asked. She told me. I sent it. That night, she cried in my arms and told me I was saving her life. I believed her. 2 weeks later, her brother needed money for school supplies. Then her mother needed tests done privately to avoid waiting lists. Then the landlord raised the rent. Each request came with explanation. Context. Emotion. Each time I told myself this was what support looked like. When I finally told Linda the truth, it wasn't dramatic. I've met someone, I said over the phone. Silence. I don't know what that means yet, I added, cowardly even in confession. She didn't scream, didn't insult me. I gave you my whole life, she said softly, and you replaced it without even asking if I was okay. I'm sorry, I said. I know, she replied, but that doesn't change anything. Dave called the next day. I heard, he said. I didn't plan it. No one ever does. He paused. I'm buying you out. What? I can't do this anymore. I can't be part of whatever this has become. I didn't argue. I didn't have the energy. The divorce papers came 2 months later. Lucia held me while I read them. You can start over, she whispered. Here, with me. I wanted to believe that more than anything I'd ever wanted before. But somewhere, deep beneath the relief and the warmth and the illusion of purpose, a quiet fear started to grow. Because the more I gave, the more she needed. And the more she needed, the less certain I was that what we had was love, or just the shape love takes when money fills the silence. I lay awake one night listening to her breathe beside me, realizing I had crossed so many lines that I could no longer see where I'd started. And the question that wouldn't let me sleep wasn't whether I'd ruined my old life. It was whether I was slowly buying a new one that would eventually cost even more. The collapse didn't come all at once. It came in pieces, spread out just enough that I could keep denying what was happening. By the time I realized something was wrong, I was already too deep to pull myself out without losing everything I had left. It started with small changes in Lucia, subtle ones, the kind you explain away if you want to believe. She became more distracted. On her phone, more. Less present when we were together. Conversations that used to stretch late into the night ended early, her attention drifting. When I asked what was wrong, she always had an answer ready. She was tired, she was stressed, she had a headache. I told myself that was normal. Life wasn't a movie. People didn't stay glowing forever. But then the requests changed. They weren't framed as help anymore. They were framed as expectations. My mother needs a new treatment, she said one morning, not looking at me. How much? I asked automatically. She told me. I sent it. My brother wants to transfer schools, she said another day. Is that necessary? She sighed. Do you want him to have a future or not? The way she said it made me feel small, petty, ungenerous. I apologized. That was the moment something inside me twisted. I didn't notice it then, but looking back, that was the exact point where love stopped being mutual and became conditional. The arguments started soon after. Not shouting, not drama, just tension, coldness. Her withdrawing when I didn't immediately agree to something. One night, I told her I needed to slow down on spending. Just for a bit, I said carefully. I'm not saying no, I just need to be more careful. She stared at me like I'd insulted her. You told me you'd take care of me, she said. I am, I replied, but I'm not limitless. She laughed. Not kindly. You're a foreigner with a pension. You're fine. The way she said it, casual, dismissive, made my stomach drop. I gave up my life for you, I said quietly. I didn't ask you to, she replied. That sentence stayed with me. After that, she started staying out later, saying she was meeting friends, studying, running errands. I stopped asking too many questions because every answer felt like a test I didn't want to fail. One evening, while she was in the shower, her phone buzzed on the nightstand. I wasn't trying to snoop. I swear that. I just glanced at the screen when it lit up. A man's name I didn't recognize. A message preview I couldn't unread. Miss you tonight. My chest tightened. When she came back into the room, I asked her about it. Calmly. Too calmly. She didn't deny it. He's just a friend, she said. Friends don't say that, I replied. She shrugged. You're being paranoid. I wanted to believe her. God, I wanted to believe her. But the doubt had already taken root. Over the next few weeks, I noticed more things. Her phone always face down. Messages cleared. Sudden mood swings tied to money. Affection that came easily when I just paid for something and disappeared when I hadn't. One night, after a particularly tense dinner, I finally said what I'd been afraid to say. Do you love me? She didn't answer right away. That pause told me everything. I care about you, she said finally. Why are you making this complicated? Because love shouldn't feel like a transaction, I wanted to say. Instead, I nodded. The breaking point came over something stupid. A bag. A designer one she'd seen online. I really want it, she said, sliding her phone across the table. It's expensive, I replied. You can afford it. I don't want to keep spending like this. Her eyes hardened. Then maybe you're not the man I thought you were. That hurt more than I expected. What does that mean? I asked. It means I need security, she said, not promises. Something inside me finally snapped. I'm not an ATM, I said. I'm a person. She stared at me, expression flat. And I'm not your retirement project, she replied. The silence that followed was heavy and final. She packed a bag that night and went to stay with a friend. Or so she said. I didn't try to stop her. For the first time since I'd arrived in Mexico, I was alone. The apartment felt unfamiliar without her. Too quiet, too empty. I sat on the couch staring at the wall, replaying every conversation, every choice, every moment where I'd ignored that small voice telling me to slow down. 2 days later, I went to the cafe where we'd first met. She didn't work there anymore. A coworker recognized me and avoided my eyes. That was when the reality finally hit me. Not as a sharp pain, but as a deep, hollow understanding. I hadn't been special, I hadn't been chosen, I had been useful. Lucia came by the apartment a week later to collect the rest of her things. We stood awkwardly in the living room, strangers pretending not to be. "I never meant to hurt you," she said. "I believe that," I replied. "And somehow, I did." "But you knew what this was," she added. "You're not a child." She was right. That was the cruelest part. I watched her leave with a finality that felt permanent. The next morning, I checked my bank account. The numbers didn't lie. Between the money I'd sent, the rent, the lifestyle, the legal fees back home, the buyout from the business, I'd burned through more than I ever thought possible. And there was nothing to show for it. No partner, no family, no future plan. Just a city that suddenly felt enormous and indifferent. I called Dave. It went to voicemail. I didn't leave a message. I thought about calling Linda. I didn't. Instead, I walked through streets I'd once loved, past cafes and bars that no longer held magic. Everything looked the same, but it all felt stripped of meaning. That night, sitting alone in the apartment I could barely afford now, I opened my laptop and searched for flights home. One-way tickets stared back at me. I could leave, start over, face the damage, or I could stay. Because the most terrifying realization of all wasn't that I'd been used, it was that even now, knowing the truth, part of me still missed the feeling more than the person. As I lay there in the dark, listening to distant traffic and my own breathing, one question refused to let me rest. Was I ready to face the life I destroyed? Or was I about to make the mistake of trying to replace it again? I didn't leave Mexico. That's the part people expect to be different. The redemption arc. The moment where I pack my bags, go home, beg for forgiveness, rebuild something resembling dignity. I looked at the flight options that night, closed the laptop, and stayed exactly where I was. Not because I was brave, not because I was hopeful, because I was empty. The next morning, the apartment felt like it belonged to someone else. Lucia's mug still sat by the sink, a hair tie on the bathroom counter. The faint smell of her shampoo clung to the air, mocking me with how recent everything was. I threw most of it away, not angrily, not dramatically, just methodically, like clearing out a storage unit you could no longer afford. For days, I barely spoke to anyone. I ate when I remembered to, walked aimlessly through neighborhoods I'd once felt proud to navigate, places that had made me feel younger, braver, chosen. Now they just felt loud. The business was gone. Dave never returned my calls. I didn't blame him. I wouldn't have trusted me either. Linda didn't reach out again. And after a few weeks, I accepted that she never would. That silence hurt more than any argument could have. I downsized. Moved out of the apartment Lucia had loved and into a smaller place in a quieter part of the city. A simple unit in a working neighborhood where no one knew me and no one cared. I told myself it was practical, honest. Really, it was all I could afford. That should have been the end of it. The consequence. The punishment. But loneliness doesn't disappear just because you understand it. 2 weeks after Lucia left, I found myself walking past a bar I'd never noticed before. Nothing flashy, no neon, just music spilling out onto the sidewalk and people standing close together laughing. I stopped. I knew exactly what I was doing. Inside, it was dim and crowded, a mix of locals and foreigners, cheap drinks, familiar energy, that same dangerous warmth creeping back into my chest. A woman smiled at me from across the room. She was older than Lucia, early 30s maybe, confident. Tired eyes. Real ones. She sat next to me without asking. "What's your name?" she said. I hesitated. "Thomas," I replied. She introduced herself as Elena. She worked nearby, lived with her sister. Had a son who stayed with her mother most nights so she could work late. She didn't touch my arm. Didn't laugh too hard, didn't pretend I was special. And somehow, that made it easier. We talked, drank, shared pieces of ourselves that felt safe to give away. When she asked what I did for work, I said I was retired. She nodded. No judgment, no curiosity beyond politeness. When she asked where I lived, I told her vaguely. When she asked if I was married, I said no. That was a lie, but it felt closer to the truth than anything I'd said in months. We didn't leave together that night, or the next, or the one after that. Instead, we fell into a rhythm, casual, undefined, comfortable, and then, slowly, the requests began. Nothing dramatic. Taxi money when she worked late, help with groceries when her sister was sick, a little extra when her son needed school supplies. I gave it willingly. Because this time, I told myself, I understood the rules. I wasn't in love. I wasn't saving anyone. I wasn't pretending this was something it wasn't. I was paying for companionship. That honesty should have made it safer. It didn't. Because even when you strip away the illusion, the feeling remains. Being wanted. Being needed. Being looked at like you matter. I started going out more, drinking more, sleeping less. The days blurred together. My pension covered the basics. The rest went out the door in small, unremarkable increments that added up faster than I wanted to admit. I stopped checking my bank balance regularly. When I did, I felt a familiar knot in my stomach and ignored it. Sandra, my wife, emailed me once. Just one sentence. I hope you're well. That was it. No anger, no blame, no invitation. I stared at the screen for a long time before closing it without replying. What could I say? That I was sorry. That I understood now. That I was still chasing the same feeling that had destroyed us. None of it mattered anymore. Months passed. I learned the city in a different way. Not as a visitor. Not as a man pretending he was starting over. But as someone hiding in plain sight. I watched other men arrive. I could spot them immediately. The posture, the curiosity, the hunger they thought was excitement. I wanted to warn them. I never did, because I knew they wouldn't listen, because I hadn't. One night, sitting alone on the balcony of my small apartment, I did the math. The money I'd spent since that first trip. The divorce settlement. The business equity I'd walked away from. The cost of starting over at my age. The number was obscene, not because I couldn't survive, but because of what I'd traded for it. A marriage that had lasted 4 decades. Children who no longer returned my calls. A partner who'd believed in me long after I'd stopped believing in myself. All gone. And for what? Moments. Illusions. A feeling that faded the moment I was alone again. The most unsettling realization wasn't regret. It was clarity. I finally understood that none of the women I'd been with had ruined my life. I had. They didn't trick me. They didn't force me. They didn't steal anything I hadn't already placed in their hands willingly. I wasn't naive. I was lonely. And loneliness, when mixed with money and access, becomes something corrosive. It eats away at your judgment slowly, politely, until one day you look around and realize there's nothing solid left to stand on. I still go out sometimes. Not as much. Not with the same desperation. I've learned to pace myself. To say no occasionally. To pretend restraint equals growth. But late at night, when the city quiets and the distractions fade, I feel it again. That ache. The need to be seen. And that's when I understand the truth I've been avoiding since the beginning. I didn't come to Mexico to start a business. I didn't come here for adventure. I didn't even come here for love. I came here because at home, I had already begun disappearing. And this place let me feel visible again, even if it was only an illusion. The tragedy isn't that I lost everything. It's that part of me still wonders if the feeling was worth the cost. I'm older now, thinner, quieter, more careful with my words. But some nights, as I sit alone listening to traffic echo through streets that no longer feel new, I ask myself the question I've been avoiding for years. If I were given the chance to go back, to the moment before I boarded that first plane, before I told myself one trip couldn't hurt, would I choose differently? And the answer scares me, because I don't know. I really don't know.